Young billionaire buys an abandoned hotel and finds a poor girl in the basement with newborn twins. She cries and says, "We live here. Please don't throw us out." What he discovers next will break your heart. Large raindrops were pounding down when Paul parked his car in front of the Grandview Hotel. The 6-story building, once majestic, now looked like a dormant giant against the grey sky. The taxi driver who had brought him from the airport had given him a strange look upon hearing the destination. "Are you sure this is the place, sir? It's been shut down for years." Paul only nodded, offering no explanation. Now staring at the peeling facade, he understood the driver's confusion. Nobody would expect a man in an Italian suit to willingly walk into an abandoned hotel on a rainy day. But Paul Devereaux, at 32, had learned that life rarely follows expectations. He adjusted his umbrella and walked toward the main entrance. The key he'd received from the auctioneer felt heavy in his pocket. 3 weeks ago, he hadn't even known this place existed. Now, it was his, another property to add to his already extensive list of assets. The lobby was surprisingly intact, shielded from the elements. A thin layer of dust covered the front desk and the cracked marble floor. Paul ran a finger over a small side table, drawing a line in the dust. The silence was almost tangible, as though the air were waiting for something. "It's not exactly the Ritz, is it?" he murmured to himself, his voice echoing faintly against the walls. His assistant, Diana, had questioned why he wanted to personally visit the place. "We can send the assessment team first. There's no need for you to bother," she'd argued. But Paul insisted. Maybe he was curious, or maybe he just needed to get out of the office and do something, anything, on his own. Ever since his grandmother Margaret's death 6 months ago, Paul had felt as though he were watching his own life from a distance. He woke up, worked, ate, slept, repeated it. Days blurred together. His empire kept growing. Stocks rose, acquisitions closed, contracts got signed. None of it seemed to matter. Margaret had been the only constant in his life since his parents died in an accident when he was just 5. She was the one who raised him, who taught him to read, who held his hand on his first day of school, who clapped the loudest at his graduation. She was the one who hugged him when he sold his first company at 23, whispering, "I'm proud of you. But remember that money is just a number. People are what really matter." Now she was gone, and Paul wondered if he had ever truly understood what she'd tried to teach him. He walked further into the lobby, his steps stirring up little swirls of dust. On the wall behind the front desk, a large, crooked painting, an old seascape, hung askew. For some reason, it made him think of the summer vacation he'd spent with his grandmother in a small coastal town when he was 10. How she smiled whenever she saw him building sandcastles, how she held his hand when the waves got too strong. "Focus, Paul," he muttered to himself, trying to push the memory aside. He was here on business. The plan was straightforward. Assess the structure, decide whether it was worth renovating the hotel or better to demolish it and build something new. Numbers, projections, return on investment. Those he understood well. In his suit pocket, he carried a folder with the building's blueprints. He opened it and studied the drawings. The Grandview had been built in the 1950s. A mid-sized hotel that had seen better days. 6 floors, 68 rooms, a restaurant, an event hall, and a small pool. In the basement were the laundry, staff quarters, and maintenance areas. Paul decided on a quick walkthrough of the place, starting from the upper floors and working his way down to the basement. He needed a general idea before the technical team arrived the next day. The elevator obviously didn't work. Paul headed for the stairwell, climbing slowly. With every step, the darkness seemed to grow denser. He turned on his phone's flashlight, illuminating stairs draped in dust and cobwebs. On the 6th floor, he opened one of the rooms. The furniture was still there, a double bed, a wardrobe, a simple desk. Through the window, one could see the entire city, its lights beginning to flicker on as daylight faded. It wasn't a bad view. With the right renovation, the place might regain some charm. Passing by one of the rooms on the 4th floor, Paul suddenly stopped. Something about that particular room felt familiar, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He stepped inside, sweeping the space with his flashlight. It looked like any other. Bed, wardrobe, desk. But there was something. Then he realized. The curtains. They were blue with small boat designs, identical to the ones his grandmother used in her guest room, where he slept on weekends before he moved in with her for good. Impossible, he murmured. But there they were, the same shade of blue, the same little boats. How could they be here, in an abandoned hotel hundreds of miles from his grandmother's home? Paul approached, touching the dusty fabric. For an instant he could have sworn he smelled Margaret's perfume, that blend of lavender and vanilla that always surrounded her. A lump formed in his throat. "Grandma," he whispered, feeling foolish immediately. Of course she wasn't there. It was just an empty room with curtains that coincidentally looked like hers. Nothing more. He shook his head, snapping back to reality. He couldn't afford to get sentimental. There was an entire hotel to inspect, and daylight was running out. The middle floors revealed nothing special. On the second floor, Paul found what looked like the manager's room, a larger space with a small attached sitting area. On the first floor, besides the lobby, there was the restaurant and the event hall, both laden with dust and neglect. Finally, it was time to check the basement. The door leading to the service staircase was locked, but one of the keys on the keychain he'd been given opened it. The stairway was even narrower and darker than the main one. As he descended, the temperature dropped with each step, and the air became denser and damp. The phone's flashlight cast unsettling shadows on the concrete walls. Paul could hear the distant drip of water somewhere. The hotel wasn't as silent as it had first seemed. Down here there was a subtle symphony of noises, old pipes groaning, wind finding its way through invisible cracks, little creaks from the settling structure. The basement was larger than Paul expected. There was an industrial laundry room with big machines still draped in plastic sheets, a boiler room, enormous and silent, a storage room for cleaning supplies with empty shelves and a few forgotten buckets in a corner, and, finally, a narrow corridor that, according to the blueprints, led to the old staff quarters. Paul hesitated a moment before entering that corridor. There was something in the air, a foreboding, perhaps, the sense that something significant awaited him beyond that dark passage. He straightened his tie, an automatic gesture of regaining control, and moved forward. The corridor had 6 doors, 3 on each side, all closed. Likely small rooms for staff who lived too far away to commute daily. Paul began opening each one methodically, shining his light into empty, desolate spaces. When he reached the last door, he heard it. The sound was so low, so unexpected. He thought for a moment he was imagining it. He stopped, holding his breath to listen more carefully. There it was again, a muffled sob, the unmistakable cry of a child. Paul's heart pounded. Children in an abandoned hotel, perhaps homeless or something worse. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice echoing in a way it hadn't upstairs. Silence. Then a rustling sound, like someone moving quickly. Paul approached the door. "I won't hurt anyone," he said, keeping his tone calm and firm. "I just want to help." More silence. Then, barely audible, the sound of held breath. Carefully, he pushed the door. It was stuck, and he had to force it. The rusty hinges screeched, almost screaming in the basement's quiet. His flashlight swept the small room. There was a single bed, a simple wardrobe, a chair, and in the far corner, curled against the wall like a trapped animal, was a little girl. She could not have been more than 5 or 6. Her brown hair was tangled, her dress, far too big for her thin frame, was dirty and worn. Her eyes, huge in her pale face, were locked on Paul with a mix of fear and defiance. And she wasn't alone. Next to her, wrapped in blankets, were 2 babies, so tiny they barely peeked out from the nest of cloth. "Hi," Paul said, keeping his voice low and gentle, like speaking to a frightened bird. "There's no need to be scared. I won't hurt you." He took a step forward. Instantly, the girl shrank back, clutching the babies to her. "Stay away!" she shouted, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so small. Paul halted, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said. "I just want to help. My name is Paul. What's yours?" The girl bit her lip, clearly torn between fear of this stranger and the urgency of caring for the babies. "Claire," she finally replied, almost inaudible. "Claire," Paul repeated. offering a gentle smile. "That's a lovely name. Are those your little brothers?" She nodded, reluctant. One of the babies started whimpering, and she automatically soothed him, showing a surprising skill for someone so young. "He's hungry," Claire explained, as if Paul should understand the urgency. "And Tom needs a fresh diaper. We ran out yesterday." Paul tried to process what he was seeing, a 5-year-old girl caring for 2 babies alone in a cold, damp basement of an abandoned hotel. How was this possible? "Claire, where are your parents?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. The girl's eyes filled with tears and her lower lip trembled. Suddenly, her small chest heaved, and within seconds she was sobbing, big tears rolling down her dirty cheeks. "We live here. Don't make us leave. Please," she begged between sobs. Paul felt something icy slip down his spine. Clearly, the girl expected to be kicked out, sent off into the cold unknown. How many times had this already happened to her? How many places had she called home, only to be thrown out later? "No one's kicking you out," he assured her, crouching down to her level. "I promise. But I need to know where your mom or dad is." Claire swallowed a sob, looking at Paul with an intensity that made him feel as though he was being judged by someone far older and wiser than 5. "Mom's name is Sophie," she finally said, her voice cracking. "She lay down over there yesterday and never woke up." Paul followed the girl's gaze to the bed. There was what appeared to be a small mound of blankets. At first glance, he hadn't noticed anything unusual. Then he realized someone lay under those blankets, someone who wasn't moving. Heart pounding, Paul approached the bed. This time, the girl did not protest, only watched with eyes that seemed far too knowing for her age. Slowly, Paul pulled back part of the blanket. The face of a young woman appeared, eyes closed, skin pale, lips slightly blue. He didn't need to be a doctor to know she was gone. The shock hit him like a freight train. This woman, Sophie, had died here, in this dark, cold room, leaving 3 small children alone. How long had the girl cared for her siblings, watching over her mother's body, waiting for a miracle that would never come? He turned to Claire, trying to control his emotions. "Claire, you've been very brave," he said, crouching down again so she didn't have to look up at him. "But now I have to call some people to help, okay? To take care of your mom and you." Panic flashed across her face. "They're gonna take us away, separate us." "No," Paul promised, with more conviction than he probably should. "I'll make sure you stay together, I promise." One of the babies began crying more insistently. Paul looked at the children, hungry, frightened, alone, and made a decision. "I'm going to make a quick phone call," he told Claire. "Then we'll get you all some food, okay?" He moved away slightly, but kept the children in sight as he took out his phone. His first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped him. This required discretion, sensitivity. These children had been through enough trauma. Instead, he called Diana, his assistant. "Diana, I need urgent help," he said as soon as she answered. "I'm at the hotel, and I found—" He hesitated, looking at the children. "I found a delicate situation. 3 kids, their mother passed away. I need you to contact local social services, but discreetly. And send someone to buy baby supplies, formula, diapers, milk, clean clothes, anything young children might need. Also, I'll need a doctor we can trust. And, Diana, about the mother. We need to handle this as quietly as possible." Diana asked no questions, one of the reasons Paul kept her as his personal assistant. She simply said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes with everything." While he waited, Paul returned to Claire and the babies. He took off his suit jacket and placed it over the girl's shoulders, who shivered slightly at its warmth. "Help is on the way," he said, sitting on the floor near her but not too close, so she wouldn't feel threatened. "My friend will bring food for you and the babies." Claire nodded, still wary but visibly relieved that someone was taking charge. "What are your little brothers' names?" Paul asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Ted and Tom," she answered. "They're twins. They're 9 months old. And you, how old are you?" 5, Claire said, holding up a small hand with 5 fingers spread out. 5 years old, practically a baby herself, carrying the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. Have you been living here for a long time? Claire thought for a moment. Since the babies were really little. Mum said it was safe here, that no one would find us. That explained why the hotel was relatively intact, despite being abandoned. Sophie had likely kept it locked, so no one would discover they were living there. Is Mommy going to be okay? Claire asked suddenly, her large, hopeful eyes fixed on Paul. The question caught him off guard. How does one explain death to a 5-year-old? Claire, he began, choosing his words carefully, your mum, she's not going to wake up anymore. She's gone somewhere far away. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't break down. She simply nodded as though she already suspected the truth. She was really tired. I'm sure she fought very hard to stay with you, Paul said, feeling a lump in his throat. She must have loved you 3 very much. Claire didn't respond, continuing to rock the babies gently. They looked malnourished and exhausted, but miraculously alive. Less than 30 minutes later, Diana arrived with a discreet doctor on Paul's corporate payroll and a social worker who had been contacted under assurances of confidentiality. The doctor immediately examined the babies, while Diana laid out bags of food, diapers, and clean clothes on the floor next to Claire. The girl watched everything with a mixture of suspicion and hope. The babies are dehydrated and malnourished, but surprisingly stable given the circumstances, the doctor reported to Paul. The girl is also malnourished, but she's managed a bit better. They'll need hospital care. The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Bennett, watched with professional yet kind eyes. This is a highly sensitive situation, she told Paul when they had a moment alone. Normally, the children would be placed in separate foster homes while we investigate any relatives who might assume custody. Something knotted inside Paul. Separate them? They've already lost their mother. They can't lose each other too. Mrs. Bennett nodded. That's my concern as well, especially considering the older girl has been caring for the twins. Their bond is crucial right now. Is there an alternative? Paul asked. The social worker studied him for a moment. Well, if someone were willing to assume emergency temporary custody of all 3 while we investigate further, Paul didn't hesitate. I'll do it. Mrs. Bennett seemed surprised. Mr. Devereux, I understand your desire to help, but caring for 3 small children, especially under such traumatic circumstances, isn't a decision one makes impulsively. It's not impulsive, Paul replied, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. I found them. I feel responsible. And I have the resources to ensure they get everything they need. The social worker evaluated him for a few seconds longer, then sighed. We'll need to run background checks, inspect your home to ensure it's suitable for children, and you'll have to sign multiple documents. Whatever it takes, Paul cut in. Just don't separate these children. While they discussed the details, discreet medical and police teams arrived to handle Sophie's body. Paul insisted Claire not witness any of it, so he distracted her, along with Diana, by showing them the new clothes and toys that had been brought. When it was time to leave, Claire grabbed Paul's hand with a surprising strength for someone so small. Where are we going? She asked, her eyes still wary. Paul knelt down in front of her. We're going to my house. It's big and has plenty of room for the 3 of you. You'll stay together, I promise. Claire looked at him, then at the twins, who were being tended to by nurses. Are we coming back here afterward? Paul thought of the cold, dark room, of the mother who would never return, of the childhood these children had almost lost entirely. No, Claire. You'll never need to come back to this place again. As they left the abandoned hotel, Paul carrying Claire in his arms, the twins being carefully carried by medical staff, he felt a weight settle on his shoulders. It wasn't an unpleasant weight, he realized. It was the weight of responsibility, of connection. For months, ever since his grandmother passed, Paul had felt empty, as if a part of him had died along with her. Now, holding this frightened child who had displayed more courage than most adults he knew, he felt something different, something he hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Purpose. In the car on the way to the hospital, where the twins would receive the care they needed before going to Paul's house, Claire finally fell asleep, exhausted by fear and too much responsibility. Her small hand clutched Paul's shirt, as though afraid he might vanish the way her mother did. Paul looked at her sleeping face and made a silent promise, not only to Claire and her brothers, but also to himself and, in some way, to his grandmother. These children would never be alone again. They would never again know abandonment, fear, or hunger. And maybe, just maybe, by caring for them, he could find what he had lost when Margaret died, a sense of family, of belonging. The echo in the empty halls of his own life might finally be filled by something other than silence. Paul's car pulled into the emergency entrance of St. Andrew's Memorial Hospital, where a medical team was already waiting for them. Diana had phoned ahead to make sure they would receive immediate attention. The twins, still asleep in hastily arranged blankets, were gently transferred to infant stretchers. Claire, still clinging to Paul's hand, watched with wide, anxious eyes. "Will they be okay?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Yes," Paul reassured her, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "These are very good doctors. They'll take care of your little brothers, and you too." A middle-aged doctor approached, introducing herself as Dr. Patel, head of pediatrics. Her smile was kind, though her eyes assessed the children with the clinical precision of someone immediately evaluating their condition. "We'll take them for some tests," she explained, "so you can come along." The next few hours were a whirlwind of medical procedures, forms, and hushed conversations. The twins were found to be dehydrated and malnourished but stable, considering the circumstances. Claire, though thin and obviously lacking proper care, was in better shape than her brothers. "It's extraordinary, Dr. Patel commented to Paul, while they watched Claire being weighed by a nurse. "This girl kept 2 infants alive under conditions many adults would have found impossible." Paul only nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He thought of the children's mother, a woman who had taught her 5-year-old daughter to care for twin babies with such efficiency that they survived even after her death. What kind of love and desperation lay behind that lesson? After consulting with Mrs. Bennett, the social worker, it was decided the children wouldn't need to be admitted for a long stay. They would receive vitamin supplements, a special diet, and regular medical follow-ups. But they could go home. For now, home would be Paul's home, at least temporarily. "We have some basic clothes and supplies for you," Paul explained to Claire as they waited for the final paperwork. "And tomorrow we'll buy everything else you need." Claire, sitting on the exam table with her legs dangling, nodded seriously. Her eyes never left her brothers for very long, as though afraid they might disappear if she didn't keep watch. "We're going to live at your house." "Yes, at least for now," Paul replied. "Here it's a big house, sir, with plenty of space for the 3 of you." The girl considered this for a moment. "Is it far from here?" "Not too far. About a 20-minute drive." Claire seemed either satisfied or resigned. Paul realized she'd probably never had the luxury of questioning adults. She must have learned early on that protesting rarely changed her fate. An hour later, they were back in the car. The twins, now clean, fed, and in new clothes provided by the hospital, slept in borrowed baby seats. Claire gazed out the window, taking in the streets and neighborhoods passing by. When the car finally stopped in front of Paul's house, the girl couldn't hide her amazement. It wasn't ostentatious, but an elegant property in one of the city's more exclusive neighborhoods, an entirely different world from the dark, damp basement they had been found in. "We're here," Paul announced, trying to sound casual. With help from the nurses hired by Diana, they carried the still sleeping twins and entered the house. Paul watched Claire's face as she took it all in: the wide foyer, the polished wood floors, the sweeping staircase leading to the second floor, the artwork on the walls, the soft but plentiful lighting. "This whole house is yours?" she finally asked in a small voice filled with disbelief. "Yes, I live alone," Paul replied. "Well, my housekeeper, Martha, is here too, but she's on leave this week." In truth, Paul had given Martha paid time off, guessing she might not react well to the sudden invasion of children into her meticulously maintained home. Paul showed Claire around: the living room with floor-to-ceiling windows, the spacious kitchen, the formal dining room he rarely used, the office where he spent most of his time when at home. On the second floor, he pointed out the master suite and 3 guest rooms, all elegantly decorated yet clearly unused. "Which one will be our room?" Claire asked. looking around warily as though afraid to touch or break something. Paul realized he hadn't thought this through. There were enough bedrooms for each child to have one, but something told him that wouldn't be right. Not after everything they'd gone through. "I think this one might be good for all three of you, at least for now," he suggested, indicating the largest guest room, adjacent to his. "What do you think?" Claire entered hesitantly, her small fingers brushing the silk duvet on the queen-size bed, testing its texture. "It's really soft," she observed, almost to herself. "But we need cribs for the babies," Paul realized aloud. "For tonight, we might have to improvise." "Big drawers," Claire suggested promptly. "Mom used to line big drawers with blankets when they were newborns." Paul felt a pang, picturing that desperate mother trying to raise 3 children with so few resources. "Drawers, yes, that's a good idea," he agreed. "Let's see if we have some that will work." With the nurse's help, they turned 2 large drawers from an old dresser into makeshift cribs, lining them with soft blankets. Claire supervised with the seriousness of a veteran mother, instructing exactly how the blankets should be folded. "They like being wrapped up tight," she explained, "so they feel safe." The twins woke almost simultaneously, as though in sync. One of them, Ted, Claire identified, started crying loudly. "He's hungry," Claire announced confidently, as if she had heard that cry hundreds of times. One of the nurses prepared bottles according to the hospital's dietary instructions. Paul watched, fascinated, as Claire tested the milk's temperature on her wrist with the efficiency of an experienced mother. "It's good," she confirmed. Paul picked Ted up, a bit awkwardly, under Claire's watchful eye, and tried to feed him. The baby fussed, turning away from the bottle. "Not like that," Claire corrected him gently. "You have to hold him higher, with his head here." She rearranged Paul's arms to form a better angle. Following the little expert's directions, Paul finally got Ted to accept the bottle. The tiny boy sucked hungrily, eyes fixed on the face of the adult feeding him. "You're doing it right," Claire approved, watching the scene while the other nurse tended to Tom. After being fed, changed and soothed, the twins fell asleep again in their makeshift cribs. Claire, though visibly exhausted, fought sleep, insisting she had to watch over her brothers. "You need to rest too," Paul said softly. "It's been a really long day." The girl hesitated, looking at the big bed that seemed to intimidate her with its comfort. After a moment, she grabbed one of the extra blankets and spread it on the floor between the 2 drawers. "I'll sleep here," she announced, "so I can hear if they cry." Paul wanted to protest, to tell her the bed was far more comfortable and that the nurses would watch the twins during the night. But something in her determined gaze stopped him. She needed that sense of control, that responsibility. It was part of who she was now. "All right," he agreed, "but if you change your mind, the bed's right here." He helped her settle on the floor, making sure she had enough blankets. Claire curled up like a little cocoon, her eyes already heavy with the sleep that was finally overtaking her. "Good night, Claire," Paul said softly. "I'm in the room next door if you need anything." "Good night," she replied, her voice already slurred by impending sleep. Paul lingered by the door for a few minutes, watching the 3 children, the twins in their improvised cribs, Claire on the floor between them, all asleep now, safe for the first time in a long while. He felt something swell inside him, an emotion he couldn't fully name. Responsibility, certainly. Concern, inevitably. But there was also something else, something that felt dangerously like love. The next morning, Paul woke early after a restless night's sleep. He checked on the children before doing anything else. The twins were still asleep, but the spot where Claire had been lying was empty. Panicking momentarily, he wondered if she had run away, but he soon found her in the kitchen, talking earnestly with the night nurse about preparing her brother's bottles. "Good morning," Paul said. "Did you sleep well?" Claire nodded. "The floor's softer than the hotel." The simplicity of that statement hit Paul like a punch. To this child, a relatively comfortable floor was a luxury worth noting. After breakfast, cereal with milk for Claire, black coffee for Paul, special formula for the twins. It was time to figure out their new routine. "We have a lot to do today," Paul announced. "We need to buy proper cribs, clothes that fit you, toys, books." Claire looked up from her cereal, confused at the mention of toys. Paul felt a pang of sadness, realizing toys were probably never part of her limited experience. Diana arrived soon after, bringing an interior decorator and a list of upscale children's stores. Paul gave specific instructions. He wanted the children's room transformed by the end of the day, with safe cribs, appropriate furniture, and everything else 3 children might need. And toys, he emphasized. Lots of toys. While the decorator measured the room and took notes, Paul, Claire, and the nurses took the twins to shop. The first stop was a children's clothing store, where Paul let Claire pick out some items for herself. The girl looked visibly uncomfortable with the task. "I don't know what to choose," she admitted softly. "What color do you like?" Paul asked, trying to help. Claire shrugged, looking around as though the question was some kind of test. Any color. He realized she'd probably never had the chance to choose anything in her life, not even the color of a t-shirt. "We'll try a bunch of things," he suggested, "and see what looks best on you." Gradually, through trial and error, they discovered Claire preferred purple to pink, pants to dresses, and t-shirts with animals rather than princesses. Each small discovery about her preferences felt like a treasure to Paul. Another piece of the puzzle that was this extraordinary little girl. After the clothing store, they visited a large toy store. Paul would never forget Claire's expression upon entering that colorful, noisy world. Her eyes opened so wide they seemed half her face, and her mouth formed a small O of wonder. "Can I take a look around?" she asked, hesitant. "Of course," Paul replied, "and you can choose anything you like." Claire walked slowly through the aisles, touching the toys with reverence. She stopped timidly in front of a shelf of stuffed bears, picking up a medium-sized one with soft brown fur. "This one's pretty," she murmured, stroking it gently before putting it back. "Would you like to take it home?" Paul asked. Claire seemed surprised by the question. "I can." "You can choose whatever you want," Paul repeated. "That's why we're here." Slowly, almost mistrustfully, Claire picked the bear up again, hugging it to her chest. Her first toy chosen by herself. Paul felt tears sting his eyes. 2 hours and many shopping bags later, they returned home, where the decorator and her team were working at full speed. Paul took Claire and the twins to the living room, where they had lunch while the transformation took place upstairs. By late afternoon, the decorator announced she was finished. Paul took Claire by the hand and led her to the room, followed by the nurses carrying the twins. The transformation was remarkable. What had been an elegant but impersonal guest room was now a magical space. The walls had been painted a soft aqua, with glow-in-the-dark star decals. 2 high-quality cribs were positioned side by side near the window. Claire's bed now had a light lavender canopy. A soft, colorful rug covered part of the floor, creating the perfect play area. There was also a bookshelf filled with children's books, toys neatly organized in bright storage bins, and a dresser full of new clothes. Claire stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning every inch of the newly transformed room. Is this for us?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It's all yours," Paul confirmed. She took a few hesitant steps inside, touching the bed's canopy, looking at the fancy cribs, picking a book off the shelf. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes conveyed far more than the word could contain. In the following weeks, a routine took shape. Paul learned how to care for the twins, making frequent mistakes, diapers put on backwards, spilled bottles, baths that left him wetter than the babies. Claire watched his efforts with a mix of amusement and concern, offering surprisingly useful tips. "You have to rock him like this after eating." She demonstrated the correct burping technique for Ted. "And Tom doesn't like his ears wiped. Be careful." Paul followed her instructions humbly, amazed by the intuitive knowledge of this 5-year-old child. "You're a great teacher, Claire," he praised her often. Little by little, Claire began allowing herself to be a child. At first, these were fleeting moments. A smile when she discovered how fun it was to jump on the soft bed, a giggle when Paul used silly voices while reading stories. Then longer spells of carefree play, building towers with colorful blocks, drawing with crayons, hugging her new stuffed bears before bedtime. Paul completely reorganized his life. Meetings were cancelled or moved online. Projects were delegated. Mornings, once devoted to important phone calls and contract reviews, were now filled with feeding bottles, diaper changes, and reading children's books. Oddly, he felt more productive in the short bursts he still dedicated to work. There was no time to micromanage or obsess over perfection. Mrs. Bennett, the social worker, visited regularly to observe the children's adaptation and evaluate the environment. Always discreet and professional, she asked questions, checked documents, and spoke privately with Claire. After one such visit, when Claire was already asleep, Mrs. Bennett sat down with Paul in his office. "I have to say, I'm impressed, Mr. Devereux," she began. "The children are adapting remarkably well, considering everything. Claire, in particular, is showing emotional recovery that I didn't expect so soon." "I'm doing my best," Paul replied simply. "I can see that," Mrs. Bennett agreed. "Which leads me to a question. What are your long-term intentions?" Paul paused, realizing this was a crucial inquiry. It had all started as an instinctive response to an emergency, a humanitarian gesture. But now, "I want to keep them with me," he answered honestly. "Permanently, if possible." "You're talking about adoption." The word had never been spoken before, but as soon as he heard it, Paul knew that was exactly what he wanted. "Yes, adoption." Mrs. Bennett studied him for a moment. "It's a complex process, Mr. Devereux, especially for a single man with no prior parenting experience, and we're still trying to locate any relatives who might assume custody. But if you don't find anyone, then your chances would be reasonable," she conceded. "You have resources, stability, and there's already an obvious bond between you and the children." That night, after Mrs. Bennett left, Paul checked on the children before turning in. The twins slept peacefully in their cribs, and Claire, finally convinced to sleep in the bed rather than the floor, was wrapped up in her covers, hugging the brown teddy bear she'd chosen at the toy store. Standing in the doorway, watching the three sleeping children, Paul was struck by a clear, crystalline realization. The house, once merely a place where he slept and worked, had become something else. These walls, once silent witnesses to his loneliness, now echoed with childish laughter, occasional cries, conversations, and bedtime stories. What had begun as an emergency response, an instinctive reaction to a tragedy, had become the most meaningful thing he had ever done. He couldn't imagine the house without these children now, without Claire's hesitant smile, the twins babbling, the cheerful mess of toys in the living room, the small piles of brightly colored clothes in the laundry. He couldn't imagine his life without them. With that certainty in his heart, Paul gently closed the door to the children's room and went to his own, where his laptop sat open to a page listing the legal requirements for adoption. He knew it would be a long road, but for the first time since his grandmother's death, he felt he had found something worth fighting for with all his strength. The house that was once his alone had changed, just as he had. Now, it was truly a home that welcomed. 3 weeks had passed since Paul found the children in the hotel's basement, 21 days that felt both like an eternity and a blink of an eye. The routine, once so predictable, was now punctuated by small daily discoveries and unexpected moments that filled the once silent house with a true sense of family. The twins, Ted and Tom, were unrecognizable. No longer the malnourished, lethargic babies Paul had discovered. With proper nutrition, medical care, and plenty of affection, they had gained weight, color in their cheeks, and an energy that surprised everyone. Ted, the quieter of the two, had discovered the joy of rolling around on the thick living room rug, while Tom, more vocal, was practicing his first babbling noises that almost sounded like words. Claire, meanwhile, was blossoming slowly, like a plant kept too long in the shade finally finding the sun. She still had moments of intense seriousness, times when her eyes would grow distant, and Paul knew she was reliving losses no child should ever face. But there were also more frequent smiles, curious questions about the world around her, and even occasional laughter when something delighted her unexpectedly. The evening had been peaceful. The twins went to sleep without Tom's usual fuss. Claire had spent time drawing with her new colored pencils, creating a family of bears living in a blue house with yellow windows. Now, after a warm bath, dressed in purple pajamas, her forever favorite color, she was settling into bed. It was Paul's favorite time of day, reading a bedtime story to Claire. She had chosen a book about a family of rabbits who had adventures in the forest, one of her favorites. Paul sat on the edge of the bed and began reading, making different voices for each character the way he knew she liked. Claire listened intently, eyes following the illustrations, occasionally asking about words she didn't recognize. Gradually, her eyelids grew heavier, and Paul noticed sleep was near. He closed the book softly as he reached the end of the story. "I think it's time to sleep," he said, tucking the covers around her. She nodded, but instead of curling up immediately as usual, she gazed at the ceiling, where small, glow-in-the-dark stars twinkled. "Everything okay?" Paul asked, noticing her hesitation. She was quiet for a moment, as though organizing her thoughts. Then, without looking directly at him, she asked in a small but clear voice, "If someone wants to take us away, can you say that we want to stay with you?" The question hit Paul like a physical blow. His heart hammered in his chest. It was the first time Claire had explicitly voiced the desire to remain with him, for their temporary arrangement to become something more. Until now, she had simply taken each day as it came, never allowing herself the vulnerability of wanting something that might not happen. Paul held her small hand in his, feeling a tightness in his throat. He wanted to say yes immediately, that he would do anything to keep them, that he couldn't imagine life without them, but he couldn't find the words. The enormity of what was at stake, the lives of these three children, his own heart, rendered him momentarily speechless. Claire waited, eyes now locked on him, trying to read his expression in the dim light. Paul gave her hand a gentle squeeze, hoping to convey through touch what he couldn't yet say out loud. "Sleep well, Claire," he finally managed, kissing her forehead. "Oh, we'll talk more tomorrow." The girl seemed to accept his reply, or at least sense there was no rejection in it. She turned on her side, hugging the stuffed bear she never let go of, and closed her eyes. Paul stayed until her breathing steadied, indicating she'd fallen asleep. He left the room, leaving the door ajar just how she liked it, and headed to his study. He sank into the armchair by the window, the one that had belonged to his grandmother, and was one of the few things he had kept from her house. Margaret, his grandmother, the woman who'd raised him after his parents' premature death, who welcomed him into her home and her heart without hesitation, rearranging her entire life to become the mother he needed. The memories washed over him in waves, Margaret reading to him before bed, just as he now did with Claire. Margaret holding his hand on his first day of school when he was terrified of being away from her. Margaret applauding every small achievement, every good grade, every swim meet. Margaret, elderly yet proud, at his college graduation, telling him his parents would have loved to see the man he'd become. Paul closed his eyes, a tear escaping. Now, for the first time, he truly understood what his grandmother had done for him. It wasn't just providing shelter, food, or education, although all of that was essential. It was about unconditional love, a constant presence, the hands that were always there to hold his in difficult moments, the hands that care. Now his own hands were caring for Claire, Ted, and Tom, hands learning to change diapers, warm bottles to the right temperature, wipe away tears, applaud small victories, hands that, he realized, could no longer let go of them. For the first time since he found the children, Paul allowed himself to name what he felt. Love. It was love that filled his chest every time Ted smiled upon seeing him enter the room, love that warmed his heart when Tom snuggled into his arms after feeding, love that made his throat tighten whenever Claire tried, with great seriousness, to teach him the best way to fold the baby's clothes. It was love, both terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Or the next morning, Paul woke up early. He had made a decision during the night, after hours of tossing and turning, thinking about Claire's question and all it meant. While preparing breakfast, fruit puree for the twins, pancakes for Claire and himself, he called Diana. "Cancel all my external appointments for the next few days," he said the moment she answered, "and schedule a meeting with the best family lawyer we can find, today, if possible." Diana, ever efficient, didn't question him. "Of course, Mr. Devereaux, may I ask what it's regarding so I can inform the lawyer?" "Adoption," Paul replied, feeling a certainty he rarely experienced in other areas of his life. "I want to start the adoption process for the children." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Diana spoke, her usually professional voice suddenly warm. "I'll get right on it, sir. And if I may say so, I think it's a wonderful decision." Paul hung up just as Claire walked into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, hair tousled, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Good morning," she said, sitting down at the table where her place was already set with a glass of orange juice and colorful plastic utensils. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Paul teased, placing a pancake on her plate. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded, picking up the fork. She seemed quieter than usual, and Paul suspected she was worried about last night's conversation, about the question she'd asked and how he hadn't answered directly. The twins soon joined them, brought by the nanny who was now helping in the mornings. Ted and Tom were settled into their high chairs, and the daily challenge of feeding them, always chaotic, began. Only when everyone was finished and the twins were playing in their activity mats in the adjacent room did Paul see his chance to talk to Claire. "Remember what you asked me last night?" he began, sitting beside her on the sofa. Claire immediately tensed, eyes fixed on her hands. "Yes," she said almost inaudibly. "I'm sorry I didn't answer you right away," Paul continued. "Your question was very important and I wanted to be sure of my response." Claire lifted her gaze, her expression cautious but hopeful. "So, what is it?" Paul took a deep breath. "Yes, if anyone tries to take you away, I'm going to say, no, I'm going to do a lot more than just say that you three want to stay with me, and that I want you here with me. Forever." Claire's eyes widened, and for an instant Paul feared he had been too direct, placing too great a burden on her small shoulders. "Forever," she whispered, "like a real family." "Exactly like a real family," Paul replied, feeling a tightness in his throat. "If you, Ted, and Tom want that, of course." Claire was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a move that caught Paul completely by surprise, she launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "We want it," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "We really do." Paul hugged her back, blinking away tears he refused to hide. This moment was about her emotions, not his, about her hope, finally allowed to flourish. "Then that's what we'll do," he promised, kissing the top of her head. "I'm starting the process today." The next weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Paul dove headfirst into the complex process of obtaining temporary legal custody, the first step toward formal adoption. There were countless forms, interviews, and home visits to arrange. Mrs. Bennett, the social worker overseeing the case, proved a valuable ally. Though always maintaining her professionalism, she seemed genuinely supportive of the children staying with Paul. "I rarely see such a successful adaptation," she observed during one of her visits. "Claire is making remarkable emotional progress, and the twins are thriving. But most importantly, there's a clear bond between you." The family lawyer Paul hired, a middle-aged man named Robert Mills with decades of experience in adoption cases, was also optimistic. "We have a few advantages," he explained during a meeting to review documents. "Your financial status is obviously a plus. Your home and lifestyle offer stability. The social worker's report is extremely positive, and the fact that the children are already in your care, adapting well, weighs heavily in your favor." "What about potential downsides?" Paul asked, always pragmatic. "Being single with no prior experience raising kids might raise some questions, but it's nothing we can't address," Mills replied. "The key is to keep documenting the children's progress under your care and demonstrate your long-term commitment to their well-being." As the legal proceedings moved forward, Paul completely overhauled his professional life. Business trips were eliminated. In-person meetings were minimized. The work that once consumed 12 to 14 hours a day was compressed into the time when the children were at preschool or asleep. Yes, preschool. Claire had started attending a half-day kindergarten, which initially terrified her, but which she now looked forward to each morning. The twins, nearing their first birthday, went to daycare at the same institution, easing the logistics and comforting Claire, who still felt responsible for her brother's well-being. Evenings, once filled with contract reviews and spreadsheets, were now dedicated to bath time, bedtime stories, and lullabies. Paul discovered he could finalize in 20 minutes the same meetings that used to drag on for 2 hours, simply because he knew Claire was waiting for story time, a sacred ritual for both of them. The house, which had already transformed since the children's arrival, continued evolving. What began as a quickly furnished room was now a truly personalized space. Claire had picked out new wall decals, dinosaurs, her current obsession since Paul took her to a natural history museum. The once pristine, minimalist living room now had a permanent corner devoted to toys, and no one minded the occasional building block found under the couch. On Paul's desk, beside his laptop and important documents, stood a framed drawing by Claire, 4 stick figures of different heights, all holding hands beneath a smiling sun. On the back, in the shaky handwriting of someone learning to write, were the words, "My family." Paul looked at that drawing whenever doubts arose, when the legal process seemed too slow, when nights of teething babies left him exhausted, when he wondered whether he could truly be a good father. Family. That's what they had become. An unlikely family, born of chance and tragedy, but now more real than anything Paul had ever known. He still hadn't said the words. Those 3 simple yet monumental words that filled his chest each time Ted recognized him with a smile. Tom stretched out his arms for a hug, or Claire proudly showed off a new drawing or talked about her day at school. But he knew, with absolute certainty, he already loved them with a depth he'd once learned from his grandmother. Love expressed more in actions than words, in the hands that care and protect. Hands he silently swore, as he watched the 3 children sleep, would never abandon them. The adoption process moved forward, although more slowly than Paul would have liked. All necessary paperwork had been submitted, the initial interviews completed, and the house had passed all inspections. Mrs. Bennett continued submitting positive reports about the children's adaptation and Paul's capacity as their guardian. But one obstacle remained, preventing the process from advancing to the next stage, formally identifying the children's mother. Sophie, that was the only name Claire knew. Without a full name, official records, or a clear history, it was impossible to legally declare the children available for adoption. Paul was in his home office, reviewing some documents, while the twins napped and Claire drew quietly on the living room rug. The girl's concentration was impressive, her tongue sticking out at the corner of her mouth as she painstakingly worked on her artwork. The phone rang, pulling Paul from his thoughts. It was Detective Ramirez from the local police, who had been assigned to investigate the mother's identity. "Mr. Devereaux," greeted the detective. "We've made some headway, but we're still having trouble identifying the woman found at the hotel. No fingerprints on file, no documents, no recent residence records. It's as if she simply disappeared off the map." Paul sighed in frustration. "I understand. Is there anything else we can do? We're working with a forensic artist's sketch of what she might have looked like, based on the condition of the body, also using approximate age and the estimated date of death. But we need more info. The older girl doesn't remember anything else. A last name, maybe. Where her mother worked before, any relatives. Claire only knows her first name, Sophie, and that she cleaned places, as she puts it, likely a maid or a housekeeper, but I'll try talking to her again, see if I can find out more." After hanging up, Paul watched Claire for a moment. She had adapted so well over the last weeks, smiling more, fewer nightmares, making friends at kindergarten. He hated dragging her back to that painful past, but it had to be done. "Claire," he called gently, moving to sit on the floor beside her. "That drawing is beautiful." The girl looked up at him with that shy smile that still squeezed his heart. "It's our house," she explained, pointing at the big rectangular shape on the paper. "And that's us." 4 stick figures in varying sizes stood hand in front of the house. "It's perfect," he praised sincerely. Then, choosing his words carefully, he added, "Claire, I need to ask you some things about your mom, about Sophie. Is that okay?" Her expression immediately grew more serious, but she nodded. "We're trying to find out more about her. Do you remember where she worked before, or if she had any name besides Sophie?" Claire frowned, thinking hard. "She cleaned rooms in a big hotel, Sometimes she took me with her before the babies were born. It was a fancy place, with red carpets and lots of mirrors. Paul felt a chill. A fancy hotel with red carpets and mirrors could describe any high-end hotel, but a suspicion began to form in his mind. "Do you remember the name of the hotel?" Claire shook her head. "No, but there was a little crown design on the door." Paul's heart skipped a beat. A crown! His own hotel chain, Devereux Hospitality, used a stylized crown as its logo. Could it be? What about her last name, or any friend or relative she might have mentioned? Claire thought a bit more. She had a friend named Justine, who also cleaned rooms, and her last name. Her eyes lit up with remembrance. It started with L. She taught me how to spell. LS something. Lambert? Lamont? Lamar? Paul offered. Lambert, that's it, Claire exclaimed. Sophie Lambert. She taught me how to write it, but I never got the B right. Paul felt a wave of simultaneous relief and dread. Thank you, Claire. That helps a lot. He smiled at her, trying to hide his turmoil. You can go back to your drawing now. It's looking really nice. Returning to his office, Paul immediately called Detective Ramirez, passing along the new information. Then, his hands trembling slightly, he placed another call to Diana, his assistant. Diana, I need you to check something urgently. Go through the employee records for all our hotels in the region for a woman named Sophie Lambert, probably a housekeeper. I need to know when she worked for us, which location, and when and why she left. Diana's voice sounded worried. Of course, Mr. Devereux. This is about the children, isn't it? I'm afraid so, Paul replied, his mouth dry. And please be absolutely discreet. While he waited for Diana's response, Paul found it impossible to focus on anything else. He paced his office, tortured by the possibility forming in his mind. If Sophie Lambert had worked in one of his hotels, if she'd been his employee. The phone rang 20 minutes later. Diana, efficient as ever, had found what he needed. Mr. Devereux. Her voice was oddly restrained. I found her records. Sophie Lambert worked as a housekeeper at the Devereux Plaza from 2017 to 2019. She was let go in October of 2019, when the hotel's housekeeping was outsourced. Paul felt as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. October 2019. He remembered the decision, a recommendation from his finance team to cut operational costs. Dozens of employees laid off and replaced with a contracted cleaning service. He had signed the documents without a second thought, focused only on the numbers. Was there anything else in her file? He asked, his voice rasping. Just the basics. She was 29 at the time of termination, single, no dependents listed. Diana paused. Sir, does this mean... Thank you, Diana. I need to call Detective Ramirez. Paul ended the call before she could say more. With a heavy heart, he shared the information with the police. The detective promised to accelerate the investigation now that they had a full name and details of her last known job. That night, once the children were asleep, Paul sat on his porch, a glass of whiskey untouched by his side. The possibility that Sophie Lambert, Claire's and the twins' mother, had once been his employee, fired due to a cost-cutting measure he approved, was devastating. Try as he might to rationalize, he didn't know her personally. He wasn't aware of her situation. The decision affected dozens of staff, not just her. Paul couldn't stop the growing sense of responsibility. If Sophie had worked for him, lost her livelihood because of a line in a spreadsheet he signed off on. 2 days later, Mrs. Bennett asked to meet him at her downtown office. Her tone on the phone had been grave, indicating important news. Paul left the children with the nanny and made his way there, his chest tight with dread ever since the revelation about Sophie. The social worker greeted him with her usual professionalism, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of empathy and concern, that alerted Paul the news wouldn't be easy. Mr. Devereux, she began once he was seated across from her desk. We have the results of the investigation into the children's mother. She opened a file in front of her, though she seemed to know its contents by heart. Sophie Lambert, 31, worked as a housekeeper at the Devereux Plaza Hotel until October 2019, when she was laid off during an outsourcing process. Mrs. Bennett paused, watching Paul's reaction. He only nodded, jaw clenched. Yes, we discovered that connection. She worked for my company. There's more, the social worker continued. After her dismissal, Sophie tried to find other jobs, but she was 6 months pregnant with the twins and struggled to get hired. Apparently, the children's father, who also worked in maintenance at the same hotel, abandoned her when he found out about the pregnancy. He had been laid off in the same outsourcing wave. Paul closed his eyes for a moment, feeling each word like a blade. Her last recorded address was a small apartment near the hotel. She was evicted 3 months after losing her job for non-payment of rent. After that, there's no official record of where she lived. That's when she moved into the abandoned hotel, Paul said, voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Bennett nodded. From what we can piece together from the few belongings found and a former colleague who identified her, Sophie found out about the decommissioned hotel while searching for a place to stay. Since it was part of the same chain where she'd worked, she knew the layout and how to sneak in, how to tap into the water supply, how to remain hidden. Paul felt sick. The picture forming was horrifying. A pregnant woman, recently unemployed and abandoned, with no resources, finding refuge in a vacant building that, cruelly, belonged to the same company that had fired her. The twins were born about 3 months after she settled in the hotel, Mrs. Bennett continued. From what we can deduce, she cared for them alone, with help from her older daughter. They survived on odd jobs Sophie managed to secure, and occasional help from a few acquaintances who knew of her situation, such as the former colleague who came forward. But the pandemic made everything harder. The cause of death was pneumonia, untreated because she lacked access to medical care. The room seemed to spin around Paul, the pandemic. Of course, while he was safe in his home, attending virtual meetings and watching his assets grow, Sophie Lambert was dying in a cold basement, trying to protect her children until her final breath. Mr. Devereaux, Mrs. Bennett's voice brought him back. I know this is extremely difficult. The connection between you and the children's mother is complicated, but I want to assure you, it doesn't negatively impact the adoption process. In fact, now that we have her full identity and confirmed there are no close relatives, we can move to the next steps. Paul barely heard her. In his mind, a single haunting truth repeated itself. A corporate decision he signed had set off the chain of events leading to this woman's death and nearly to the children's demise. A decision of mine took everything from her, he muttered, more to himself than to the social worker. Mr. Devereaux, you can't hold yourself personally. But I am responsible, Paul interrupted, his voice cracking. I signed those papers. I approved that cost cut. I never even considered the real people behind those numbers on a spreadsheet. And now 3 children are left without a mother. To Mrs. Bennett's surprise, tears began rolling down Paul's cheeks. She had only ever seen him poised and in control. Now he was openly devastated. Claire once asked me why her mum wouldn't wake up, he continued, trying to steady his voice. What do I tell her now? That her mother died because I wanted to raise profit margins by 2 percentage points. Mrs. Bennett inhaled, giving Paul a moment to compose himself. What happened is tragic, no doubt, but blaming yourself won't bring Sophie back or help the children. The question now is, what will you do with this information? The question hung in the air, heavy and challenging. Paul wiped his tears with the back of his hand, trying to regain control. You're right. What matters now are the kids, Claire, Ted, and Tom. He straightened in his chair, a new resolve forming amid the pain and guilt. I can't change the past. I can't undo the decision that led Sophie to this situation, but I can, and will, make sure her children get everything they need, everything she couldn't give them. He looked at Mrs. Bennett directly, his eyes still shining with tears but now also with determination. I'm going to give them everything. Not just material comfort, but love, education, opportunities, stability. It's the least I can do. Mrs. Bennett nodded, recognizing the sincerity in his words. What about the truth? Do you plan to tell the children? Paul hadn't considered that yet. How could he explain to Claire, especially, that he was indirectly involved in the tragedy that took her mother? "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Claire is so young. But she deserves to know who her mother was. She deserves to know Sophie fought for them until the end, doing all she could with the few resources she had." He paused. "Eventually, yes, she'll learn about my connection, about the hotel, all of it, but only when she's old enough to understand. And I hope she'll also see that even though I had a role in their loss, I'm doing everything I can to be part of their healing." When Paul left Mrs. Bennett's office that afternoon, he carried a new weight, the full truth about Sophie Lambert and the undeniable connection between them. It wasn't only guilt he felt, though that was crushing. There was also a renewed commitment, strengthened by the knowledge of the real human cost of corporate decisions. In the car on his way home, to the children, he let himself cry again. He cried for the woman he had never met, but whose fate he had unwittingly sealed. He cried for the children who would forever bear their mother's absence. He cried for his own blindness, for the years of making decisions based solely on numbers, never thinking about the human stories behind them. But as the tears dried, a resolution grew within him, as strong and clear as the love he now felt for Claire, Ted, and Tom. The past couldn't be changed, but the future of those 3 children, was in his hands, and he would do everything possible to honor Sophie's sacrifice, to transform a story of loss and injustice into one of redemption and love. Sophie Lambert might have been just another name on a layoff list to Paul Devereaux, the executive, but to Paul the father, the man who was becoming a dad, she would forever be more than that. The woman who, without knowing, had taught him the value of human life and given him, through her children, the chance to be a better person than he'd ever been. Morning dawned bright and promising, as though the sky itself wished to celebrate the day's importance. Paul woke before the alarm after a restless night. It wasn't negative anxiety, but that electric anticipation that precedes the most decisive moments in life. Today was the day of the final interview with the social evaluation team. The last major hurdle before the decision on the children's permanent guardianship. He got up quietly, showered quickly, and dressed carefully, opting for a navy sweater over a white shirt and grey pants, formal enough to show seriousness, casual enough to seem at ease in his own home. Diana had suggested this balance, and Paul trusted her judgment. In the kitchen, he prepared breakfast with the efficiency of a man who had already mastered the routine. Scrambled eggs for Claire, who'd recently decided she liked them with a bit of grated cheese. Oatmeal with mashed banana for the twins, who at nearly 2 years old already had distinct food preferences. Ted favored fruit, while Tom leaned toward anything with cheese, just like his sister. As he set the table, Paul mentally revisited everything that had happened over the past months. The shock of discovering Sophie Lambert, a former employee of his hotel, had lost everything because of a cost-cutting measure he'd approved. The crushing guilt that had consumed him for weeks, until he finally heeded his therapist's advice. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor Sophie's memory by being the best father possible to her children. Then came the determination rising from the ashes of guilt, the complete restructuring of his company's employment policies, the establishment of a support fund for single mothers in vulnerable situations, the substantial donation to social housing programs. None of it would bring Sophie back, he knew, but maybe he could prevent other stories like hers from happening again. The sound of small, hurried footsteps broke his train of thought. Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in pajamas, her hair a tousled frame around a face now fuller and healthier. "Good morning," she said, rubbing her eyes. "You got up early." "Good morning, Princess," Paul replied, smiling. "We have an important day today, remember?" Claire nodded, suddenly more awake. "Today's when those people come to see if we can stay together forever, right?" The simplicity of her question caught Paul's heart. "Yes, that's right. But don't worry, it'll be fine." "I'm not worried," she declared with surprising confidence. "You keep your promises. You're not like other grown-ups." Paul felt his throat tighten. In her 6 years, Claire had learned the hard lesson that adults' promises aren't always trustworthy. Except his, apparently. "Thanks for trusting me," he said, helping her onto the kitchen stool. "Now, how about these scrambled eggs?" While Claire ate, Paul went to fetch the twins. He found them already awake in their cribs, babbling in their private language, comprehensible only to them and occasionally to Claire. "Good morning, guys," he greeted, rewarded by identical smiles that still melted him, even after all these months. "Papa!" exclaimed Ted, reaching out for him. Not to be outdone, Tom did the same. After breakfast and the usual getting ready routine, baths, clean clothes, hair combing, the house was ready for the evaluation team. Paul took one last walk through, making sure all was in order. Not that there was likely to be much out of place. Martha, his longtime housekeeper, had adapted surprisingly well to the children's presence, keeping the house immaculate despite the permanent toy corner in the living room. The intercom buzzed precisely at 10 o'clock. Paul took a deep breath, straightened his sweater, and went to answer. Mrs. Bennett arrived with two other professionals, Dr. Levine, a child psychologist who had interviewed Claire before, and Ms. Rodriguez, an adoption specialist from the state agency whom Paul had yet to meet. "Good morning, Mr. Devereaux," Mrs. Bennett greeted warmly, yet professionally. "I trust everyone is ready for our visit." "More than ready," Paul replied, ushering them into the living room. "Claire was asking about you at breakfast." As though summoned by her name, Claire appeared at the living room door, holding one of the twins' favorite books. Seeing the visitors, she paused briefly, but then proceeded with the quiet confidence she'd developed over recent months. "Hello, Mrs. Bennett," she greeted politely, then looked at the other two adults curiously. "Hello, Claire," the social worker replied with a genuine smile. "You remember Dr. Levine, and this is Ms. Rodriguez, who's here to help us today." Claire nodded, studying the newcomers with those keen eyes that always seemed to see far beyond her years. Paul still marveled at how perceptive she was. "The babies are in the playroom," she said, taking on the role of little hostess. "Want to see them?" The adults exchanged approving looks at her initiative. "We'd love to, Doctor," Levine said. Claire held out her hand to Paul, who took it at once, and together they led the visitors to the adjacent playroom where Ted and Tom were playing on a large, colorful mat. A thorough child-proofing system was in place. Outlet covers, corner guards on the furniture, a gate at the stairs. The twins, now more mobile than ever, required constant attention. Ms. Rodriguez immediately knelt to the twins' level, and they studied her with curiosity. "Hello, boys. That's a very nice toy you have there." Tom, the more sociable, offered her one of the wooden blocks in his hand. Ted, more cautious, glanced at Claire, seeking reassurance. "It's okay, Ted," Claire said, letting go of Paul's hand to go over to her brother. "They're friends." Paul watched the interaction, heart full. The bond between the three siblings was one of the most beautiful things he had ever witnessed. Claire, so young yet so protective. The twins, implicitly trusting the sister who had cared for them since birth. "Mr. Devereaux," Mrs. Bennett called, gesturing to the sofas, "shall we have a chat while Dr. Levine and Ms. Rodriguez spend some time with the children?" Paul nodded, though part of him wanted to stay with Claire and the twins. He followed Mrs. Bennett into the main living room, while the other two professionals remained behind with the children. "How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Bennett asked once they were seated. "Nervous," Paul admitted, forcing a tight smile. "But confident. We've built something real here, something good." The social worker nodded. "I can see that. The transformation in Claire, especially, is remarkable. I remember the first time I saw her back at the hotel. She was basically a miniature adult, carrying responsibilities far too heavy for her tiny shoulders. Now she seems like a child. A happy child." "She still has moments," Paul said. "Sometimes I wake at night and find her checking on the twins, making sure they're breathing, or stashing food in her nightstand as though afraid it might run out." "Scars from what she lived through," Mrs. Bennett observed. "It'll take time for those to fade, if they ever do. But the important thing is she's secure enough to gradually reclaim her childhood." Their conversation continued for about an hour, covering all the practical aspects of Paul's life with the children: routines, education, healthcare, plans for the future. Mrs. Bennett took occasional notes but mostly just listened, with the focused attention that characterized her. Then they switched places. Paul went to stay with the children, while Dr. Levine and Ms. Rodriguez met privately with Mrs. Bennett. The minutes dragged by as he tried to concentrate on the twins' games and Claire's stories, all the while aware of the low voices from the other room. Finally, Mrs. Bennet appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Devereux, could you come for a moment? Claire, would you mind staying with your brothers a bit longer?" Claire nodded solemnly, like someone entrusted with an important mission. "I can read them a story," she offered, picking a picture book from the low shelf. Paul followed Mrs. Bennet back to the living room, where Dr. Levine and Ms. Rodriguez wore carefully neutral expressions. He sat trying to steady his racing heart. "Mr. Devereux," Mrs. Rodriguez began, opening a folder on her lap, "we have a few final questions." The following questions were direct and occasionally uncomfortable, about his work schedule and how he would balance business demands with raising 3 small children, about his own childhood and losing his parents young, about his mental health after discovering his connection to Sophie Lambert. Paul answered everything truthfully, acknowledging his shortcomings but emphasizing his absolute commitment to the children. "I'm not perfect," he admitted. "I make mistakes. Sometimes I still put the twins' diapers on backwards." That earned smiles from all 3 evaluators. "But I love Claire, Ted, and Tom more than I ever thought it possible to love anyone. I'll do whatever it takes to be the father they deserve." Mrs. Rodriguez scribbled one last note and closed her folder. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Devereux. I believe we have everything we need." "So what happens now?" he asked, unable to hide his anxiety. "Now," Mrs. Bennet explained, "we need to deliberate. But first, there's something I need to show you." She opened her own folder and removed a sealed plastic envelope. This was found among Sophie Lambert's belongings in the hotel basement. The police kept it during the investigation, but it's been released now. We believe you should see it. Paul accepted the envelope with slightly shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of plain paper, folded carefully. He recognized immediately the delicate handwriting, though it seemed made by someone weak or unwell. It was a letter, or rather a brief note. "To whoever finds my children. If you're reading this, it probably means I'm no longer here to care for them. I beg you, please, don't separate them. Claire needs her brothers as much as they need her. And please, don't let my children be lost. They are all I have. Tell them I loved them with every breath, until my last. Sophie L." Paul felt tears sting his eyes once more. The simplicity of those words, the concern of a mother who, even facing her own mortality, thought only of her children's well-being, was heartbreaking. "Don't let my children be lost," he whispered, rereading it. "They're all I have." He looked up to see the 3 evaluators watching him with sympathetic expressions. "They're all I have now too," he murmured, more to himself. Mrs. Bennet offered him a tissue, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. Carefully folding the note, he slipped it back into the envelope. "I believe you should keep it," the social worker said, "to show the children when they're older, so they know how much their mother loved them." Paul nodded, speechless. The weight of what Sophie Lambert lost and what he gained had never felt so real. "Well," said Dr. Levine, gently breaking the emotional silence, "I think we should discuss our observations in private now. Mr. Devereux, would you mind returning to the children while we deliberate?" Paul took a deep breath, composing himself. "Of course." He went back to the playroom, finding Claire reading enthusiastically to the twins, using different voices for each character, just as he did for her. Ted and Tom sat on the rug, captivated by the story and the bright pictures she showed them. "And then the little bunny found its way home," Claire was reading, turning the page carefully. "Because home is where your family is." "That's a great story," Paul commented, sitting down with them on the floor. Claire looked up with a smile. "It's their favorite." Then, noticing his expression, she frowned. "Are you sad?" Paul shook his head. "No, not sad. Just emotional." "Because the people are here to decide if we can stay together?" she asked, direct as always. "Yes, that's part of it." Claire closed the book and, to Paul's surprise, climbed into his lap, a gesture of affection she seldom initiated. "It's going to be fine," she said with a surprising certainty. "We belong together, like a real family." The twins, seeing their sister in Paul's lap, toddled over with unsteady steps to join the cuddle, each claiming a knee. That was how the evaluation team found them 15 minutes later, Paul sitting on the floor with all three children in his lap, reading the story Claire had started, so absorbed in their moment, they seemed oblivious to the rest of the world. Mrs. Bennet cleared her throat softly to get their attention. Paul looked up, unable to stand with the precious weight of the children on him, and tried to read the expressions of the three specialists. To his relief, they were all smiling. "Mr. Devereux," Mrs. Bennet began, her professional tone gentled by the scene before her. "After a thorough evaluation and considering all the relevant factors, we are ready to make our recommendation to the court." Paul felt Claire tense in his arms. Instinctively, he tightened his hold around her for reassurance and for himself. "Our unanimous recommendation is to grant you permanent custody of these three minors," Mrs. Bennet continued. "With Sophie Lambert's complete identification and confirmation that there are no living relatives, the formal adoption process can begin as soon as permanent custody is awarded." For a moment, Paul couldn't speak, emotion constricting his throat. Claire spoke first. "Does that mean we get to stay together? Forever?" Miss Rodriguez smiled at her. "Yes, Claire. It means exactly that." She turned to Paul, her eyes shining with mixed hope and fear, as though afraid to fully believe in the promise of permanence. "We're real now?" she asked quietly. Tears finally spilled down Paul's cheeks, but he didn't care. He smiled through them, placing his hands gently on Claire's small face. "It's real, and it's forever," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. The smile that lit Claire's face, a smile without reservations or shadows, pure childhood joy, was like sunrise after the longest night. She threw her arms around Paul's neck, hugging him with all the strength her little body could muster. The twins, sensing the joy, joined in their own way, clapping and laughing. The evaluators watched the scene with moved smiles, even the ever-professional Mrs. Bennet discreetly dabbing at an eye. "There are still some administrative details," she said gently, not wanting to break the moment but mindful of her role. "And the formal court hearing is set for next week, but it's just a formality at this point." Paul nodded, not letting go of the children. "We'll be there. All of us." After the evaluation team left, Paul and the children celebrated with an impromptu picnic in the living room, eating sandwiches and chocolate cake on a blanket spread over the rug, laughing and making plans for a future they would now officially share. That night, after the twins were asleep and Claire was in bed, Paul returned to his office and opened Sophie's note again. He read it several times, absorbing every word, honoring the woman he never knew but to whom he owed everything. "Don't let my children be lost," she had written. Paul looked at the framed photo on his desk, him, Claire, and the twins at the zoo, all smiling for the camera, a true family in every way that mattered. "They'll never be lost, Sophie," he promised aloud, "and you'll never be forgotten. Not them, not you." In the hallway, without Paul noticing, Claire stood at the slightly open office door, listening. She slipped quietly back to her room, snuggling under her covers with a small smile. Finally, after so much uncertainty, she was certain of one thing. They were home. Really home. Forever. And that was all that mattered. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. 8 months had passed since the final court hearing, where the judge had made official what their hearts already knew. They were a family, legally, definitively, forever. The sun shone brightly that July morning as the car pulled up in front of what was once the Grandview Hotel. The building, once decrepit and abandoned, now boasted a refurbished facade, gleaming windows, fresh paint, and a new name elegantly displayed above the entrance: Lambert Residence. Paul took a deep breath, taking in the sight of the building that had changed his life. 2 years ago, none of this had seemed possible, neither the transformation of the old hotel nor the even deeper transformation that had happened within himself. "It looks beautiful, doesn't it?" he remarked to Claire, who was looking out the car window, eyes wide at the drastic change in the place where Paul had found her. "It doesn't even look like the same place," she replied, clearly impressed. Her small fingers fidgeted nervously with the edge of her purple dress, still her favorite color, one of the few certainties she carried from her past. Paul adjusted his tie, still not entirely comfortable with formal wear even after years of corporate life. But today was different. It wasn't the businessman wearing the tie, it was the father, the man who had learned the true meaning of family in the most unexpected way. The original idea had come to him the day they discovered Sophie Lambert's background, that she'd once been employed by his hotel, fired during an outsourcing push he'd approved. That night, unable to sleep, haunted by guilt and the unexpected connection, Paul had begun planning something to bring meaning to that tragedy. Now, less than a year later, the project was complete. The Grandview Hotel had been entirely renovated into a residential complex for families in vulnerable situations, especially single parents and low-wage workers, exactly the kind of situations Sophie had once faced. "Are you nervous?" he asked Claire, noticing how she smoothed her dress repeatedly. The nearly 7-year-old shook her head, though her worried lip-biting betrayed her tension. "A little," she admitted. "What if I do it wrong?" "You can't do it wrong," Paul reassured her. "You just hold the scissors and cut the ribbon when I say so, that's all." She nodded, appearing more confident. In the back seat, Ted and Tom sat in car seats, unusually quiet, perhaps sensing the day's importance. At nearly 3 years old, the twins were no longer the fragile infants Paul had found. They were active little boys, each with his own distinct personality. Ted, the contemplative one who loved picture books and building block towers. Tom, the talkative explorer, with a laugh that seemed to fill the whole house. "What do you think Mom would say about today?" Claire asked suddenly, catching Paul off guard. It was a question that came up more often now that Paul spoke openly about Sophie, sharing the little they knew and keeping her memory alive as part of the children's identity. "I think she'd be very proud," he said sincerely. "Especially of you, holding the scissors at the opening ceremony." Claire smiled that smile that still made Paul's heart squeeze, a reminder of how much this little girl had overcome and how resilient she was. "Shall we?" Diana called from outside the car, glancing at her watch. "Guests are already arriving." Paul helped the children out. He carried a twin in each arm, while Claire walked beside him, carefully holding the ceremonial scissors wrapped in a purple ribbon. A small crowd had gathered at the entrance. Employees from the Devereaux Group, local officials, representatives from organizations supporting single parents and vulnerable families, along with familiar faces like Martha, almost a grandmother figure to the children now, Mrs. Bennett, the social worker who had guided them through it all, and even Detective Ramirez, who had investigated Sophie's case and now befriended the family. As Paul approached, the little crowd parted. There was a moment of silence, then applause. Claire gripped Paul's hand, partly hiding behind him. She was still shy around large groups, despite her progress. The mayor made a brief speech about the project's importance, a pioneering model in the city, meant to be replicated elsewhere. He talked about how Lambert residents provided comprehensive solutions, affordable housing for 25 families, on-site support services, communal facilities. This project not only provides dignified housing for 25 families, the mayor concluded, but also integrates services that promote autonomy and development. It's exactly the kind of holistic approach our city needs. Then it was Paul's turn. With the twins now in Diana's arms, he stood at the microphone, Claire by his side, her small face solemn with the responsibility of the moment. "Lambert Residence is not just another property," he began. "It's a commitment to the 25 families who will live here. Parents who work essential jobs, teachers, nurses, people who keep our city running but often can't afford to live in it." He paused, glancing at Claire, who watched him closely. "When I acquired this hotel at auction 2 years ago, my intention was simply to renovate it or demolish and build something else. I was thinking only in terms of return on investment, spreadsheets, profits." His voice softened. "I had no idea that within these walls I'd find something far more valuable than any financial asset." The audience's gaze shifted toward the children, and Paul saw understanding smiles. "This place holds special meaning for our family. It was here, in this very building, that I found my children, here that our lives became entwined in a way none of us could have foreseen." His voice wavered slightly. "It was here that Sophie Lambert, a woman of extraordinary courage, sheltered her children to the last. We honor her memory not only by giving her name to this residence, but by ensuring it offers protection and a fresh start to families like hers. Paul paused, placing an arm around Claire's shoulders. The little girl looked at the crowd with a bit more confidence now. I learned from my children that buildings are more than physical structures. They're places where stories unfold, where lives can be transformed. This hotel, once the site of tragedy, has been reborn as a place of hope. I can't imagine a more powerful symbol than that. Applause rose again, warmer this time. Paul guided Claire to the red ribbon spanning the entrance. Diana stepped up with the twins, one in each arm. "Let's cut it together," Paul suggested, placing his hand over Claire's as she held the scissors. With a careful motion, the ribbon was cut. Applause erupted, cameras flashed, and exclamations of approval filled the air. Claire smiled, proud of her part in the ceremony, while Ted and Tom clapped, sharing the excitement. Paul bent to pick Claire up, something he didn't do as often anymore now that she was growing, but which still felt right on special occasions. Diana came closer with the twins, who reached out, wanting to join the family embrace. For a moment, they simply stood there, gazing at the renovated building now poised to offer hope where once there had been despair. "This is where it all began and began again," Paul said softly, more to his family than to the crowd. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, a gesture of trust that had taken months to emerge naturally. The twins, eager to explore, pointed toward the entrance. Together they walked through the doors of Lambert residence. The lobby, fully refurbished, retained elements of the hotel's original architecture, but now had bright colors and open spaces. The old front desk had become a community information station. Where an underused restaurant once stood, there was now a multi-purpose area for classes, meetings, and events. Paul guided the family away from the photographers and onlookers toward a quieter section of the building. There, in what had once been the administration office, now a small memorial space, a bronze plaque told a concise version of Sophie's story. Not every detail. Some parts belonged only to them, but enough so everyone would know this place was born from a real story of loss, love, and redemption. There was also a photograph, the only one anyone could find of Sophie, provided by a former co-worker. It showed a young woman with brown hair and a shy smile, wearing the Devereux Hotel uniform, the same photo that now occupied a place of honor in their home, so the twins would know the face of the mother they hadn't had time to remember. "She looks sad here," Claire whispered, touching the frame. "I think she was," Paul answered honestly. "But she loved you three more than anything, that's what matters." Claire nodded, her understanding far beyond her 7 years. "I think she'd be happy to know we're together, that Ted and Tom are okay, and that no one got lost." "I'm sure she would," Paul agreed, feeling the familiar mix of emotions he experienced whenever he thought of Sophie Lambert. Sorrow for a life ended too soon, gratitude for the 3 precious gifts she'd left the world, and a vow to honor her sacrifice by being the best father possible. After they left the memorial, they headed for the heart of the building, where the 25 selected families would live. Simple but comfortable apartments, bathed in natural light, each furnished with the basics for those starting anew. A daycare on the ground floor, serving not only the residents but also the surrounding community. A professional training center with computers and a small library. And the basement, where it had all started, now a bright, colorful playroom. Claire hesitated at the entrance to this last space, scanning the room as though searching for traces of the place she once knew. But everything was different now. Where once there was darkness and pain, laughter and color reigned. "It feels weird," she said. "It seemed a lot bigger and darker back then." "You were smaller," Paul reminded her gently. "And you were scared." She nodded thoughtfully. Then, in a sudden burst of resolve, she went inside the playroom, sitting in one of the bright little chairs. Ted and Tom, always in tune with their sister, ran in to join her, already drawn by the scattered toys. Watching the 3 of them, Paul felt a deep certainty. They had closed a circle. What had begun in tragedy now ended in hope. What had been born of loss had grown into new life. A story that continued each day, in every one of Claire's smiles, in every discovery the twins made, in every moment they shared as the family they had become. A new story, a new family, a new beginning. If this story touched your heart, Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.